On the morning of July 31st, 2022, a violent crash shattered the quiet streets of Strongsville, Ohio. A speeding SUV left the roadway, crossed a grassy area, struck a commercial building, and burst into flames. Inside the vehicle were three young people. Only one survived. At first glance, it appeared to be another heartbreaking traffic accident involving teenagers. But as investigators began reconstructing the final seconds before impact, they discovered details that challenged that assumption. The speed, the lack of braking, the digital evidence, the relationships between the people inside the vehicle. What began as a fatal crash soon became one of the most controversial criminal cases in recent American history. Some believed it was a tragic accident. Others believed it was intentional murder. And at the center of it all was a 17-year-old girl named Mackenzie Shirilla. This is the story of the crash, the investigation, the courtroom battle, and the questions that continue to divide public opinion. Mackenzie Shirilla grew up in Northeast Ohio. Friends and relatives described her as outgoing, energetic, and close to her family. Like many teenagers, her life revolved around school, friendships, sports, and social media. She attended high school in the Cleveland metropolitan area and spent much of her free time with friends. Among those friends was 20-year-old Dominic Russo. The two had known each other for several years and were believed to have had an on-again, off-again romantic relationship. Their relationship was complicated. According to testimony later presented in court, they experienced periods of closeness mixed with arguments and emotional conflict. Another young man, 19-year-old Davion Flanagan, was also part of their social circle. By the summer of 2022, all three would find themselves together during what would become their final hours. The evening before, the crash appeared ordinary. Investigators later determined that Mackenzie, Dominic, and Davion spent time together during the night and into the early morning hours. Surveillance footage, phone records, and witness accounts helped investigators reconstruct their movements. Evidence showed they had been using marijuana during the evening. Toxicology reports later confirmed the presence of THC in the victims. However, prosecutors did not argue that intoxication alone explained what happened. Instead, investigators became focused on something else entirely: the behavior leading up to the collision, messages exchanged before the crash, and the final moments captured by surveillance cameras. As dawn approached on July 31st, Mackenzie was driving a Toyota Camry with Dominic seated in the front passenger seat. Davion was in the rear seat. The group traveled through Strongsville, a suburban community southwest of Cleveland. Traffic was light. Weather conditions were clear. Nothing suggested disaster was imminent. Yet investigators would later calculate that the vehicle accelerated dramatically in the seconds before impact. Security cameras recorded portions of the vehicle's movement. Data retrieved from the car itself would later provide even more precise information. The evidence indicated the Camry reached approximately 100 miles per hour. Rather than slowing down, the vehicle continued accelerating. It left the roadway, crossed a grassy median, hit a retaining wall, then slammed directly into the side of a commercial building. The collision was catastrophic. The force of impact ignited a massive fire. Emergency responders rushed to the scene. Flames engulfed much of the vehicle. Firefighters worked quickly to extinguish the blaze while paramedics attempted to reach the occupants. Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan were pronounced dead. Mackenzie Shirilla survived despite suffering severe injuries. She was transported to a hospital for treatment. At that moment, authorities believed they were dealing with a horrific high-speed accident. That assumption would not last. Crash reconstruction experts began examining every aspect of the collision. Modern vehicles store valuable information through electronic data recorders, often called black boxes. The Toyota's recorder preserved critical details from the final seconds before impact. Investigators discovered something unusual. There was no evidence that Mackenzie attempted to brake. There was no indication of evasive steering. Instead, the accelerator remained engaged. The steering wheel showed only minimal movement. According to investigators, the vehicle maintained a direct path toward the building. For prosecutors, this became one of the strongest pieces of evidence. They argued the absence of braking demonstrated intent rather than panic. Defense attorneys strongly disagreed. They maintained that accidents can happen in many ways, particularly when young drivers are involved. They argued that failing to brake does not automatically prove someone intended to kill. The differing interpretations of the same evidence would become central to the trial. Investigators also examined Mackenzie's phone. Digital evidence revealed emotional conversations between her and Dominic. Prosecutors argued their relationship had become increasingly strained. Text messages suggested disagreements and emotional turmoil during the days leading up to the crash. The prosecution believed these communications revealed motive. They argued Mackenzie intentionally drove into the building after becoming upset with Dominic. Defense attorneys countered that teenage relationships often involve emotional conversations and arguments. They insisted the messages failed to establish intent to commit murder. The courtroom would ultimately hear extensive testimony regarding those communications. The investigation stretched for months. Crash reconstruction specialists, digital forensic experts, medical professionals, law enforcement officers, all contributed to building a detailed timeline. Eventually, prosecutors reached a remarkable conclusion. They alleged the collision had not been an accident. Instead, they charged Mackenzie Shirilla with 2 counts of murder, 4 counts of felonious assault, and related offenses. The decision immediately attracted national attention. Cases involving alleged intentional vehicle homicides are relatively uncommon. Even more unusual was the age of the defendant. Although Mackenzie was only 17 at the time of the crash, Ohio law allowed her case to proceed in adult court. Public reaction quickly became divided. Some believed prosecutors had uncovered evidence of intentional murder. Others questioned whether the state could truly prove intent beyond a reasonable doubt. The trial began in 2023. Because Mackenzie waived her right to a jury, the case was heard before a judge. That meant every piece of evidence would be evaluated by a single decision-maker rather than 12 jurors. The prosecution carefully reconstructed the final seconds before the crash. Experts testified regarding vehicle speed, impact analysis, electronic data, surveillance footage, medical evidence, digital communications. Together, prosecutors argued these facts painted a consistent picture. They claimed Mackenzie deliberately accelerated toward the building without attempting to avoid the collision. One prosecutor described the crash as a mission. The defense rejected that characterization. Attorneys argued there was no confession, no suicide note, no witness who heard Mackenzie express an intention to kill herself or anyone else. They argued the state's theory relied heavily on interpretation rather than direct proof. Defense experts questioned aspects of the crash reconstruction. They also emphasized Mackenzie's traumatic injuries, arguing that surviving such a collision was inconsistent with an intentional murder-suicide. Throughout the proceedings, the courtroom remained emotionally charged. The families of Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan attended hearings. So did Mackenzie's relatives. Each side carried profound grief, but each viewed the tragedy through a very different lens. One of the most closely examined aspects of the case involved electronic vehicle data. Experts testified that the accelerator remained fully engaged for several seconds before impact. The vehicle reached roughly 100 miles per hour. There was no evidence of emergency braking, no last-second attempt to avoid the building. Crash reconstruction specialists stated these findings supported the conclusion that the collision was intentional. Defense attorneys challenged those conclusions. They argued human behavior during emergencies can be unpredictable. Drivers sometimes freeze, they may press the wrong pedal, or they may become overwhelmed during high-speed situations. The judge was left to determine which interpretation best fit the available evidence. The prosecution also introduced testimony regarding Mackenzie's relationship with Dominic. Witnesses described emotional tension between the two. Messages exchanged before the crash suggested conflict. Prosecutors argued the relationship had deteriorated and provided a motive for intentional violence. Defense attorneys responded that relationship problems are common among teenagers. Arguments alone, they said, cannot establish murderous intent. The debate reflected one of the central questions in criminal law. Can circumstantial evidence, when viewed together, prove intent beyond a reasonable doubt? After hearing weeks of testimony, the judge delivered the verdict. Mackenzie Shirilla was found guilty of murder and related charges. In announcing the decision, the judge stated that the evidence demonstrated the collision had been intentional. The court described the crash as a calculated act rather than an accident. The ruling immediately generated widespread media coverage. Supporters of the victims' families welcomed the verdict, believing justice had been served. Others questioned whether circumstantial evidence alone should have been enough to convict. Legal analysts discussed the significance of vehicle data, digital evidence, and crash reconstruction in modern criminal prosecutions. At sentencing, the emotional weight of the tragedy became unmistakable. Family members of Dominic, Russo, and Davion Flanagan spoke about the devastating impact of losing their sons. Their statements described futures that would never be realized, birthdays that would never be celebrated, dreams that would never come true. Mackenzie also addressed the court. She expressed sorrow over the deaths. However, the court ultimately imposed 2 concurrent sentences of 15 years to life in prison for the murder convictions, along with additional concurrent sentences on the remaining counts. Under Ohio law, she became eligible for parole after serving the required minimum term, though eligibility does not guarantee release. Following sentencing, Mackenzie's legal team filed appeals. They argued that the evidence was insufficient to establish intent beyond a reasonable doubt. Among other issues, they challenged aspects of the trial court's legal conclusions and interpretation of the evidence. As the appeals process continued, the case remained the subject of extensive legal commentary. Some experts viewed the prosecution as an example of how digital forensic evidence has transformed criminal investigations. Others cautioned against drawing firm conclusions about a person's intent based solely on crash data and circumstantial evidence. The debate extended far beyond Ohio. Across television programs, legal podcasts, and online forums, observers continued asking the same difficult question: where is the line between reckless driving and intentional homicide? The Mackenzie Shirilla case also highlighted the growing role of technology in criminal investigations. Modern vehicles record speed, steering input, braking activity, throttle position, and numerous other data points. Combined with surveillance cameras, cell phone records, GPS information, and digital communications, investigators can reconstruct events with remarkable precision. Yet technology does not always answer the most important question. It can reveal what happened. Determining why it happened often remains far more complicated. Intent exists inside the human mind. Courts must infer it from actions, surrounding circumstances, and available evidence. That challenge was at the heart of this case. For the families involved, the legal arguments could never erase the personal loss. 2 young men lost their lives before reaching adulthood's next chapter. 1 young woman entered prison facing the consequences of the court's conclusions. 3 families were permanently changed in a matter of seconds. The crash serves as a reminder that moments of emotional crisis can carry irreversible consequences. Whether viewed as intentional violence or a catastrophic sequence of decisions, the outcome remains the same. 3 young lives were forever altered. Today, the Mackenzie Shirilla case continues to be studied by legal professionals, crash reconstruction experts, and criminal investigators. It stands as one of the most debated vehicle homicide prosecutions in recent American history. The evidence convinced the trial court beyond a reasonable doubt. Yet public discussion continues because the central issue was never simply about speed. It was about intent, and intent is often the most difficult element to prove in any criminal case. The lasting legacy of this case extends beyond the courtroom. It demonstrates how modern forensic science can reconstruct nearly every second of a fatal event, while still leaving society to wrestle with difficult questions about motive, accountability, and justice. In the end, the road through Strongsville became more than the scene of a deadly collision. It became the setting for a legal battle that challenged assumptions about evidence, technology, and the thin line separating tragedy from crime. And for everyone connected to that summer morning in July 2022, the consequences remain impossible to forget. Thank you for watching. If you found this documentary informative, consider subscribing for more carefully researched true crime stories based on verified facts, court records, and official investigations. Until next time, stay informed, stay vigilant, and remember that the most unsettling mysteries are often the ones hidden in plain sight.